can turn to Nehemiah. You're going to find that that was really true of him. As we look at his life, we're looking at Nehemiah, a selfless overseer. Just a comment about Christ's relation to us. You know, Jesus said, "Follow me," and that language still holds, but as we go into the epistles, that language disappears. I think you see it twice in Peter, but that's not the picture. There's a deeper thing happens that we're still following, but Peter says, "Christ liveth in me." It's so quick, it's so easy for people to think of following as just imitating Christ. And so as we get into the epistles, it becomes very clear that it's something far more than that. It's a life that's being expressed from within us. Okay. There's a story about a group of pilgrims who were touring the Holy Land with a guide. And the guide was a native, and he was explaining to them how since time immemorial, a shepherd never walked behind his sheep to drive them, but was always in front leading them, and they followed him. Just as Jesus describes when he says, "The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name. He leads them out, and when he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice." He no sooner got finished saying that, and the group of tourists started laughing, because off to the side, there was a shepherd who actually was behind his sheep with a stick driving them. And they said, "What's this all about?" And the shepherd said, "Well, you must understand, that man is not the shepherd, he's the butcher." True shepherds do not drive. And this man Nehemiah is an amazing example of how people who are true shepherds do lead. There's a song in our hymnal, Song 120, that says it this way about God: "Power that rules by patient leading, not by force, the easier way." A true shepherd makes people want to do what they ought to do. That's the very best way I can describe a person who's really experiencing the experience of a true shepherd. And Nehemiah was just that. But he had an interesting task. How did he convince a temperamental king and to discourage people to help him to do a task against impossible odds and get it done in record time? They built that wall around that city, and a wall isn't just like this, it's a wall like this. And Jerusalem is not a really small city. They did it in 52 days. That's less than 2 months. How in the world did he get this accomplished? And what were the impossible odds? Well, I already mentioned one of them. He was dealing with a temperamental king, because when the king said, "Nehemiah, why are you sad?" it says he was gripped with fear, because these kings could just do anything. I mean, what's going to happen now that the king has asked him this question? Is he unhappy? Is he going to have him dragged out and killed? What's going to take place? We know with Queen Esther, she was put as a wife of King Ahasuerus because the former queen had dared to cross the will of Ahasuerus, and she was immediately dismissed as wife. That's how these Persian kings tended to be. In fact, it's interesting that you have to wonder, how did a Jew like Nehemiah get such a high position in the Persian government? This is a little bit of an aside here. Well, you have to understand that Esther was written, her experience preceded. I'm trying to put in perspective here. I know the book comes after Nehemiah, but Esther is between the building of the temple, which was 516 when it was finally finished, BC. And then we have Nehemiah coming along in 445 BC. And we have Esther in 478 BC. Now you have to understand this is moving towards zero. So Esther is here. And so I just want to help you understand that probably the tremendous favor that the Jewish people experienced under Esther, finally, is the reason why probably there was such favor experienced here by the Jewish people. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that he was dealing with a very temperamental king, all right? Artaxerxes, who was the son of Ahasuerus, and so we can maybe assume he had some of the same temperamental characteristics as his father. The second thing, Jerusalem was surrounded by enemies. We're told that you had Sanballat. Well, let's get Galilee on here and the Dead Sea. And here's the northern, this is Samaria, this is Judea, and Jerusalem is here. And we're told that Sanballat was a Samaritan. Sanballat, I was going to write his name instead of that. Whoop. Okay, so you have him up there, and it seems like he was the military leader. And then Tobias was an Ammonite. The Ammonites were east of the Jordan, so you have Tobiah here. And he seems to have been the CIA getting secret information to pass to this guy. You have him on the east. And then you have Geshem, who was an Arabian, so he's down here. So here you have it. You're surrounded by enemies on the north, the east, and the south, and they're all in cahoots. Now you're Nehemiah, and you're going to go and do something here, and these people have made major trouble previously. They're not good people. And you know they're still there. And they don't want this city to prosper. And they're ready to take action if anybody rises up to do anything for this city. I'm trying to have you put yourself in this man's place. He was up against impossible odds. And then you have a discouraged remnant. They had enough trouble building the temple. How in the world are you going to get them to build a wall to fortify the city, which would be a much more threatening thing to the enemies than just building a temple? You can imagine that if they got upset with the building of the temple, what in the world are they going to do? If we start to build a wall around this city, they've had free reign to do whatever they want to do up till now, and now we're going to build a wall and they're going to be shut out. You know there's going to be major trouble. Number 4, there were Jewish traders within the city. Tobiah's daughter was married to this guy's son. And this fella eventually had a room in the temple for his office. And this guy was passing secrets that he was finding out about these people to this fellow. Now, I was just meditating on this morning, and I was thinking, I'd have never taken this task. This is impossible. You're surrounded by enemies that are in cahoots, who've made major trouble before and are probably going to make more trouble if you try to build a wall. And you have traders within the city who are connected to all of this. And you have a temperamental king who probably isn't going to let you go because he obviously loved Nehemiah because of the way he responded to him. Well, why did Nehemiah tackle such a thankless task? Well, it's because he was a highly motivated person for a very important cause. It's like David, whenever he was getting a lot of criticism from his brothers, he turned to them and he said, "Isn't there a cause?" Of course there's a cause. And people like David are highly motivated, and Nehemiah, to find a way to do great things, to take care of the impossible. I mean, Goliath was impossible for this little boy. Men of faith find a way to deal with these kinds of problems. And so the title of the message this morning is Faith Finds a Way. And I'll give you my outline. But keep this map in mind. Number 1, we're going to talk about the patience of faith. And that will be 2, 1 to 4. Number 2, we're going to talk about the preparations of faith. Faith is very practical. And that will be 2, 5 to 9. And then we will talk about the precautions of faith. And that will be 2, 11 to 16. No, number 10 is not out of my mind. And then we're going to talk about the power of faith. And that will be 2, 10, and 17 to 20. So there's our outline. We're going to talk about how faith finds a way. Be followers of them who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So patience is a very important part of faith. In fact, it's amazing how much emphasis is placed on patience in the New Testament. Paul says, I glory in tribulation because it helps me develop patience. In 2 Peter, patience is one of the things in that character development, and it's right before godliness because God does not change. God is a very, very stable, patient person. And so this is a very important characteristic to have patience. We found in chapter 1 that Nehemiah could weep and pray, and we find out now that he could wait and pray. This was a very important aspect of his life. At the beginning of the book, it tells us it was the month Chislev, whenever his brother came to him. That is the month of December. And now we find at the beginning of this chapter, we're at the month of Nisan, and that's the month of April. So this man has been praying for 4 solid months since he heard of a problem that he wanted to deal with, okay? He knew that only God could change this man's heart. I think he knew the very strong relationship he had with this king. A cupbearer was probably the most influential person in the kingdom. I mean, he stood beside the king every day, and you can be sure he was very carefully chosen. I'm assuming he was strikingly handsome. I'm assuming that he was personality plus. He was a person you'd have wanted to have been around. The king wouldn't have somebody that he couldn't stand to have around. He apparently was a very, very attractive person in every way. And so these cupbearers often gave good advice to the king. I mean, go back to Joseph. It was the butler, of course, who forgot him, but all of a sudden he remembered, and it was him that influenced the king to get Joseph out of prison. And so this man was very close to the king, and he feared when the king saw that he was not happy, because I think he realized one of the reasons the king was not going to be happy about that is because it would maybe jeopardize their relationship. Maybe something came up between the two of them, and the king is concerned about this. And so I get the impression that the king really loved this man, and he was really close to the king. He had an awful lot of influence, and he was praying that God would move in the king's heart to let him go. He felt the king would not countenance him leaving. I think that's what it is. In fact, if you want to read at the end of chapter 1, it tells us what he prayed. He says, O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant and to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name and prosper. Now get this. I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. So he was praying that God would somehow give him mercy in the sight of this man. And this man would let him go and give him mercy and give him the opportunity to do what he needed to do. So he was praying day and night, it says in chapter 1. I mean, this is real persevering prayer. And he wasn't doing anything. And God wasn't doing anything. Nothing was happening. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed day and night. And for 4 months, a month went by, nothing happened. 2 months went by, nothing happened. 3 months went by, nothing happened. There seemed to be no evidence whatsoever that anything was going to happen in answer to his prayer. But apparently he knew a few verses, that the king's heart is in the hand of the king. God holds the heart of the king in his hand, and he turns it however he wants to turn it. He also had the idea that prayer, if it's persevering, takes a high rating with God. Now, Jesus hadn't yet said, he that asketh, in the King James Version, they tell me that the ETH verbs mean continuous action. And Jesus hadn't written that verse yet that says, everyone that continually asks will receive. And everyone who continually seeks will find. And everyone who continually knocks, to him it shall be opened. This is a tremendous promise. In fact, it's only a few years ago that promise struck me. And it really revolutionized my concept of prayer. And there are some things I pray for every day because they are very important to me. And nothing has happened on some of them. But I keep praying because that promise is there. So, he was persevering. And he just patiently waited. Isaiah 28:16 says, he that believeth shall not make haste. He won't do anything rash. He will wait until the time comes for the action. Psalm 40 verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. Someone has translated that, I waited. Now, I, in waiting, waited on the Lord. Sometimes we wait, but inside we're not waiting. That says the person who truly is waiting physically and spiritually and mentally and emotionally, he's completely at rest. Colossinite. God will hear their cry. And then we have Isaiah 40, verse 1, that says, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They'll renew their strength. They'll be prepared for the crucial moment of opportunity. Okay? Now, but in waiting, you're not just passive. You're not passive. You're waiting for that opportune moment. You're listening, and you're waiting. And for him, it came totally unexpectedly. I think because he was the cupbearer and was expected to be a cheerful person, he kept that up for 4 months. Walked into the presence of the king smiling and, just upbeat. But finally, his prayers and his meditations about this whole thing got to him, and he could not do that. And he was in the king's presence, and all of a sudden, the king asked a very alarming question. Nehemiah, what's the matter with you? What's the matter with you, Nehemiah? And he said, I was afraid. And I prayed. And that prayer was backed up by 4 months of praying. I don't think that little prayer he sent up there would have amounted to much if it had not been backed up by all that prayer. Let's read these first 4 verses. It is 4. And it came to pass in the month Nisan, that is April, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence, wherefore the king said unto me, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. And I said unto the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth in waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? So I prayed to God of heaven, and I said to the king, and we'll get to that next. Okay. So here was the moment of opportunity. It was totally unexpected. He had not tried to create this situation. He didn't create a pity party to get the king's attention. That just the way it all happened naturally. And he wasn't probably expecting that day for this important request to be made. He was waiting for that. He was waiting for some opportune situation that would be very obvious to him. This is my opportunity to make my request. And it came unexpectedly, and it came without any conniving on his part. It took him by surprise. He had no choice now. He had to act. The king had asked him a question. And he made a very wise appeal. If he had appealed to have this city reinforced by a wall, I'm not sure that would have blessed the king too much. But what he asked for was to go back and build some respect for the graves of his ancestors. And he mentions that twice here. And they tell me, here again, I have to rely on history, that the Persians were very, very, very focused on their ancestors, respect for the ancestors. And he knew that. And so that's how he makes his request. All right? He says, I want to deliver the burial place of my forefathers from reproach. Now, it's interesting as we read this, and let's read the next verses 5 through 9. So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it please the king, and if thy servant have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, for how long shall the journey be, and when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Moreover, I said unto the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come into Judah, and a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertaineth to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my father God upon me. Then I came to the governors beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. All right, so this thing with the queen, that's really seemed providential to me. Well, why did he put this in here? Why did he say the queen was sitting by him? Well, here you have this very personable young man who's there every day with the king, and the king's busy, and he doesn't maybe have a lot to do between handing cups to the king. And this is my imagination. And so I suspect that she and Nehemiah had lots of conversations. And like I said, he was a very personable young man, I'm sure, very, very, just a wonderful person. And she learned to really like this guy. And I kind of think that the king was really struggling with this request. And I think she was sort of saying, let him go. Just let him go. I think the significance of her being there was she helped to get this decision going in the right direction. How that all went in a very practical way, I'm not sure. That's my imagination, that the queen was, she wanted to see his request granted. Okay. So he prayed before he made his request. Even though he pretty well knew what he was going to say, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment, he was not presumptuous. He was not, he knew that if God didn't do it, it didn't matter what he said, it wasn't going to be a success. As I told you in introducing this, we find him praying all the time. Everything is prayer in Nehemiah's life. We're going to see it as we go through. And he's also a man of very decisive action. You see the word so in this book 30 times, 32 times, I think. And you get the impression that once he made up his mind, he did it. There wasn't a lot of palaver about it. So we did this, and so we did this, and so we did this. When the time was ripe, he was ready to act. All right. So why was he so successful? Well, I think part of the reason was his preparations. So we have the patience of faith that doesn't act until it's very obvious now's the time to act, and it's willing to wait for a long time. It's willing to just pray day and night and see nothing happening, and waiting for that opportune moment that's very obvious. Now's the time to act. And of course, like he got it without even trying. It just happened. But I think he was successful. I think his faith was successful because he had made preparations. It's obvious he had made preparations for this moment. He knew what he was going to say. Number one, you will notice the king set him a time. He said, set me a time. So he had figured out that the king was not going to let him go permanently. So he had figured out, if the king asked me, I'm going to ask him for a certain amount of time. And he apparently had calculated how long he thought it would take to build that wall. And he actually stayed 12 months. So he had figured that out. See, if the king would have said, set me a time, and he said, that wouldn't have worked too well. Faith works when people are prepared. Some people have the idea that faith is just when you do things spontaneously. Then you just trust God. You just do it and trust God and do this and trust God and do this and trust. No. Preparation is an evidence of faith. When you're preparing for a moment like this, you obviously believe someday it's going to happen. Number two, he asked for timber to build himself a house. He knew he was going to need wood to build a house and build some other things. And so he had calculated he's going to have to ask for permission, an official permission from the king to hand to those people. The king says, I'm supposed to have some wood. Okay? Number three, he even knew the name of the keeper of the king's forest. His name was Asaph. And I suspect he had a personal letter written to Asaph from the king, signed by the king. Asaph, you're to give this man the wood he needs. Furthermore, he knew all the trouble that Ezra had in his journey to Jerusalem and his experience. And so he had that all anticipated. He said, I want letters to every official I'm going to meet. I want letters. And so I can see him coming to the first official, and the official says, who are you? I'm Nehemiah. Well, what do you want? We're traveling to Jerusalem. Nope, you can't pass here. Here's the king's signature on this letter. Oh, okay, go ahead. And as he met each obstacle, he was prepared. He had letters with the official signature of the king, and he just went right on to Jerusalem. This man was a planner. And then the king went one better. The king sent captains of the army. I don't know if he sent the whole Persian army. I don't know. It almost sounds like the whole Persian army with this man and horsemen. Now, this is in contrast to Ezra. Ezra said he wouldn't ask for that because he had said to the king so much about how the Lord was going to do this that he thought he should not ask the king that because he said the Lord was going to do it. Well, now, how do you figure this out? Ezra does it one way. Nehemiah comes along and does the exact opposite. And what this says to me is leaders are flexible people. They don't say, well, because Ezra did it that way, this is how we're going to do it, king. No, don't send the army. Don't send the horsemen. Because he didn't ask for it. The king offered it. And I think he realized that the circumstances weren't exactly the same, and God could bless either one. And so that's a tremendous lesson here. So Nehemiah saw God's hand in it all. You see that in verse 8. He saw that it was God's hand in the king's question, the king's response, the granting of all the letters, and then a bonus on top of it, an army to go with him, and horsemen. Now I want you to see something here. I'm asked all the time when people call me on the phone why we don't see miracles today. That's a question they ask, and they want me to tell them some miracles I've seen. This man saw no miracles in the sense that they talk about. He saw miracles in these things that we're talking about. I mean, you could have called those all coincidences, but he saw miracles. He saw that God's hand was in it. And I tell people, I say, well, if you want to see miracles, live the Sermon on the Mount. A person of his own volition does not return good for evil. We all instinctively know if somebody hurt us, they deserve some hurt. A person instinctively does not live without a whole bunch of financial resources and generously sort of distribute his stuff and trust God for the future. He does not normally do that. A person does not normally tell the truth if he knows that's going to get him in trouble. He'll wiggle a little bit and try to tell the truth, but not quite. If you want to see miracles, you live the Sermon on the Mount. And you have these kinds of miracles all the time. Not miracles, sign miracles out there flashy for everybody to see, but you're aware of the fact that there are miracles taking place. You actually were able to love and respond the way you should. You actually were able to be generous with your resources when you weren't quite sure how it was all going to work out. You were in a difficult marriage, and you continued to treat your wife or your husband the way they should be treated, even though you were perhaps hurting. You found the grace to do that. And that's the kind of miracles he was seeing. And I just want to call that to your attention. He didn't see any sign miracles. There's not a single sign miracle in this book of the kind most people think about when they think about miracles. But he saw miracles all over the place, and so should you, and so should I. Okay? Well, there was opposition immediately. You can be sure that if you set out to do something that God really wants to have done, you will have opposition. Guaranteed. In fact, if you don't, there's something wrong. Here's my little poem. You have no enemies, you say? Alas, my friend, that boast is poor. He who has mingled in the fray of duty that the brave endure must have made foes. If you have none, small is the work you have done. You've hit no traitor on the hip. You've dashed no cup from perjured lip. You've never turned the wrong to right. You've been a coward in the fight. And so here are these enemies. They show up immediately. And there they are. Sanballat the Horonite up there in Samaria, Tobiah the Ammonite over to the east, and then we get down further and we find Geshem the Arabian on the south. Okay. Now, you would have expected that when he got to Jerusalem, he would have immediately started building that wall with these enemies around. Oh, this is urgent. We need to get this wall built. Elders, I want to have a meeting here. Let's hire the contractor. Let's get the materials. The sooner we get this wall up, the better, because this is a very, very urgent situation. You'd have expected that. 3 days went by and he did nothing. Verse 11, let's read this passage. Verse 11 to 16. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I rose in the night, I and some few men with me. Neither told I any man what my God had put into my heart to do at Jerusalem. They had no clue why he was there. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, into the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went on to the gate of the fountain and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the brook and viewed the wall and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley and so returned. There's your so. And the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. So 3 days went by, and he did nothing. He was silent, and God was silent. God wasn't telling him anything either, apparently. He didn't know what God had for him to do next. He didn't speak to anyone. And here's something. Leadership is really, really lonely business sometimes. Some people have the idea that leaders are out front there and everybody's applauding. No. Leaders sometimes are by themselves, praying and concentrating and meditating and viewing the situation and not knowing what to do and not knowing who to ask and not sure if anybody's going to support, and all the weight of that decision rests on them. I remember a couple occasions where I had to make a very quick decision, and there were people around me that could have helped me with the decision. I can think of one in particular. And I had to make a very quick decision. It was I could tell you the situation, but it might give away what it was. I looked at the one person, and he turned his head. He didn't want to be involved. I looked at another person. He turned his head and didn't want to be involved. They just sat there. And I had it to do. And I got in bad trouble for the decision I made, which I think was the right decision. But they didn't want to have that happen. And so leadership, if you're not prepared to take the brunt of making decisions all by yourself and taking the full responsibility behind the scenes with great risk, then don't ever plan to be a leader, okay? Leadership is very lonely. It's not glamorous, as some assume. The fame of many people who are famous as leaders comes afterward, often when they're dead. Are you aware that Abraham Lincoln was not appreciated by most people? Even people who would have supported his cause did not like the way he handled the war. What you hear about Abraham Lincoln, that's fame that he acquired tremendously after he was dead, and people could view the whole thing that he had to deal with by himself pretty much. Now, Nehemiah, again, didn't know what was going to happen next. So what did he do? What do you do when you don't know what you're going to do next? Well, he thought, well, he could at least get information together. And once he got the information together, then there'd be something to work with that God could use later in working through him. So we see in this passage that twice it says he viewed the wall. That means inspected carefully. I'll tell you what I think he was doing. I think he was looking here and he was thinking, now how are we going to deal with this? Now here's this pile of rubble you can't even pass with a horse. How are we going to do with that? How are we going to deal? Yeah, okay, we have this problem over here and this problem here. I think he had it all in his mind, what they were up against. And I think in his mind, he was developing a master plan, which we'll talk about in the next message. And finally, he was ready. He was prepared to make a powerful appeal to these people. And that brings us to the next point, the power of faith. His details from his survey showed to the people, when he finally got them together, that he had a realistic understanding of this. He wasn't just shooting from the hip. He wasn't just talking off the top of his head. He wasn't just some fly-by-night somebody that they couldn't trust. As they listened to him and he described what he saw that in that survey of the city, this man has a realistic plan. And that began to win their confidence. And that's what leaders should do. They should be able to do the things I'm just now saying. They should be able to present their case so that people say, oh, this man has thought this through. He's considered every possible problem and thing that might come up, and he's already decided how we can handle this. I think we can trust this man. I think we can go along with his proposal because he has a very detailed picture of the situation. There are too many decisions get made by leaders that are by the seat of their pants. And people are supposed to go along with them, and it turns into a huge tragedy and a huge braha. That wasn't Nehemiah. I'm trying to explain to you why this man was so effective. Number two, he gave them hope that they could eliminate their reproach. They were living there reproached. And they were honestly just sat there and thought there's nothing could be done. And he gave them hope. You know what? We could actually eliminate our reproach. We can actually build this city to be a city that has some respect and some safety and some defenses. We can actually do it. Number three, he backed up that hope with an impressive Ebenezer. I want you to notice what it says in verse 18. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me. And so he reviewed what happened with the king. He reviewed what happened with the army that was sent to him. He reviewed the queen nudging the king. He reviewed all the things that God had done and convinced them that God was in this. He has a history. of God's dealings. We can trust God for the future. He inspired in them a belief that God would continue to help them. And finally, I want you to notice the little pronouns in this passage, we and us. He was going to work with them. He identified with the problem. He wasn't expecting them to do it themselves. He didn't sit around like some leaders do. Well, you got yourself into this yourself, and you know what you need to do. You guys need to build the wall, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this. I'll be in my office, and if you need any advice, come and ask me, but I'm not going to help you. It was we and us. Nehemiah identified with the need. He was a true leader. If you want to check the leadership of a person, just see if anybody's following. See if they actually can make their case and can rally the troops. I know one prominent person, and I could say his name, but I try really hard not to identify people I talk about that you would know personally. And he started a great movement because he was so upset with the way the conference he was in was going. And he got so upset, he finally got up a group of people and tried to inspire them to do things, and not a whole lot happened. And his brother said to him, his brother told me this, he said, I said to him, the problem with you is when you say march, nobody marches. He thought he had a big name, and he did. He had a big name. He was a prominent person. If I said it, you'd all know who I'm talking about. But when he said march, nobody marched. And the problems that needed to be resolved never got resolved. He was not a leader. Matthew Henry, the great commentator, went to London. And there he met a young lady of nobility who was also wealthy. And they fell in love. She went to ask her father if she should marry him. And he said, he's got no background. You don't know where he's coming from. And she said, yes, I know, but I do know where he's going, and I'm going to follow him. There was a leader. Well, when he got done doing all the things I told you, he had inspired these people, and they said, let's rise up and build. Let's rise up and build. And they readied themselves to do it. And immediately, that opposition is there, okay? But we are not ignorant of his devices, and neither was he. And that opposition, by the way, stayed around the whole time they were building the wall. It never left. It tried one thing after another. Here it tries ridicule and intimidation. It says, we know you're going to rebel. Well, that was a threat. That's what they had said back when they threatened Ezra. And because of that, because they said these people are rebellious people, the building of the temple was stopped until they had the problem solved. And they're going to try the same trick again. We're going to go tell the king that you're building a wall because you want to rebel. And Nehemiah said no. Well, let's read these last verses here. Verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah, the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. Verse 17, then I said unto them, you see this distress we're in, and how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. See, there he promised to take away that reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God. There's the Ebenezer, all the things God had already done, which was good upon me, as also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. I told him what the king had said, how he had supported. And they said, let us rise up and build. So, there you go. They strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I unto them, and said unto them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. And they stayed with it the whole way through. In fact, a lot of our story is going to be all the stuff they did. But there came a point where they were outside the wall. In fact, halfway through it, they said, you have some of this wall built, but a fox, that's a very insubstantial wall. A fox could knock it down. This is no protection whatsoever. I mean, they did everything they could to intimidate, to ridicule, and to discourage, and to connive, which we will see later. Are we ready to rise up and build? Do we have the patience to wait? And while we're waiting, to make good preparations? And then do we even add to that some precautions when we sort of know what the enemy's up to, and we make sure we have it all put together before we give our plan? We don't tell anybody. We don't give, because we know that Tobiah's, if he hears anything, Tobiah's going to run to Sanballat, and we're going to have trouble. So we don't have to tell anybody. We're going to be precautious. We're going to wait till the Lord moves here. And once you have it all together, and you've waited, and you've prepared, and you've figured out ahead of time how you're going to meet certain dangers, then you will have the ability to accomplish something powerful. Faith has power when it's backed up by patience, preparations, and precautions. We are laborers together with God. This man never forgot that. This was God's work. He never forgot that. You find it laced all the way through this book. God did this, and God did this, and God did this, and God did this. That was his concept. He was a laborer with God, and how can you lose if you're a laborer with God? And I conclude with this verse that I love from 1 Corinthians 15. It's the last verse in the chapter, 58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, like Nehemiah, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Nehemiah is probably one of the best examples in the whole scripture of someone who understood that and labored accordingly. Are there any comments on the message?